What is more terrifying than an enemy's superweapon? It might be a weapon so deceptively simple, you refuse to believe it's defeating you. A weapon that doesn't just challenge your army, but the very foundation of your national pride and philosophy. For the engineers of the Third Reich, this weapon wasn't a jet engine or a secret rocket. In the spring of 1944, it was a riddle, wrapped in aluminum and screaming across the skies of their capital. The sound of air raid sirens was a grim, familiar symphony to the citizens of Berlin by March 1944. They had learned the rhythm of fear, the routine of seeking shelter as the Anglo-American bomber streams approached. But this time, something was profoundly different. High Command had assured them that the heart of the Reich was a fortress. The deadly rings of anti-aircraft batteries and the elite fighter wings of the Luftwaffe were supposed to make daylight bombing runs over Berlin suicidal for the enemy. For a long time, this had been largely true. Allied bombers that ventured this deep paid a horrific price in blood and steel. Yet, on this day, and the days that followed, a new and terrifying sight appeared in the cold, clear air above the sprawling city. The American B-17 flying fortresses were not alone. Swarming around them, like silver-winged predators, was a hornet's nest of P-51 Mustangs. They weren't just present, they were aggressive. They climbed, dove, and engaged the German defenders with a terrifying energy, their machine guns tearing through the wings of the vaunted Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. They flew as if the airfield they took off from was just over the horizon, not hundreds of miles away across the English Channel. And therein lay the impossibility, the maddening paradox that was causing panic within the highest echelons of the Luftwaffe. According to every calculation, every fuel consumption chart, and every law of aeronautical engineering, as understood by Germany's finest minds, what they were witnessing couldn't be happening. It was a physical and logistical absurdity. At the Luftwaffe's top-secret testing center at Rechlin, a place of scientific rigor and engineering pride, Major Klaus Richter was certain of one thing. The pilots were exaggerating. Richter was a man forged in the crucible of German technical perfection. He believed in numbers, in blueprints, in the immutable laws of physics. His world was one of precise measurements and cold, hard data. Emotion and battlefield panic had no place in his equations. The reports that flooded his desk from the front lines seemed more like fiction than fact. Even a respected voice like General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most celebrated fighter aces, was reporting the unbelievable. Galland's dispatches were frantic, insistent. The Mustangs were not just escorting the bombers to Berlin. They were arriving with full combat potential. They were dogfighting with ferocious intensity, dropping down to strafe targets of opportunity, and then escorting the surviving bombers all the way home. They showed no signs of fuel stretching or flying conservatively. They fought like they had gas to burn. Richter and his team would run the numbers again and again, their slide rules and calculators always arriving at the same unshakable conclusion. The P-51B Mustang, fitted with its powerful Packard Merlin engine, had an internal fuel capacity of approximately 269 gallons. This gave it a maximum ferry range, under ideal conditions, of about 1,140 miles. The round trip from their bases in eastern England to Berlin and back was just over 1,100 miles. On paper, it was barely possible. But a ferry range calculation assumed a straight line, a constant, economical speed, and no combat. Combat changed everything. The act of climbing to altitude, throttling up to engage an enemy, and maneuvering violently in a dogfight consumed fuel at a prodigious rate. To arrive over Berlin with enough fuel to actually fight for any length of time and then return home was mathematically impossible. There was no reserve, no margin for error. According to Richter's meticulous calculations, any P-51 pilot who engaged in a serious fight over Berlin was effectively on a suicide mission. Yet, day after day, the swarms returned. They must have a hidden fuel tank, one of his junior engineers suggested. Richter dismissed it. We've seen the schematics. We've examined the wreckage. There is no space for a significant, unaccounted-for fuel cell. A new type of fuel, then. An additive that drastically increases efficiency, another proposed. Nonsense, Richter countered. Such a breakthrough would defy thermodynamics. We would have detected traces of it. This is not magic. To Richter, the answer had to lie in American trickery, not technological superiority. Perhaps they were using a handful of specially modified aircraft on these deep raids, creating the illusion of a capability they didn't broadly possess. Or perhaps the pilots were simply mistaken, their senses overwhelmed in the chaos of battle. His pride, the collective pride of German engineering, could not accept that the Americans had solved a problem that they, the masters of technical innovation, had deemed unsolvable with conventional means. He saw it as a personal affront, a stain on the honor of his profession. The German mind, he believed, pursued perfection. The American mind, he thought, pursued mass-produced adequacy. Perfection would always triumph. Then the message arrived. It was a communication that would change everything, sending a shockwave through the sterile, ordered world of the Rechlin Test Center. A lone P-51, damaged by flak over a synthetic oil plant, had been forced to make a belly landing in a field just outside a small village. The pilot had been captured, and more importantly, the aircraft was reported to be almost entirely intact. A palpable energy filled the room, a mixture of excitement and grim determination. "We have won," the telex read. For Major Klaus Richter, this was the moment of truth. Here was his chance to peel back the skin of this enigma and expose the sophisticated, complex secret he was convinced the Americans were hiding. He would finally have the evidence to prove that this impossible range was achieved through some advanced, intricate piece of technology that his team could dissect, understand, and perhaps even counter. It was a moment of hope, a chance to restore the shaken confidence of the Luftwaffe. But as he prepared his team to travel to the crash site, a cold, unbidden sense of anxiety crept in. What if the secret they uncovered wasn't complex at all? What if the answer was something else entirely? The thought was unsettling, a dissonance he could not yet name, but it hung in the air like the distant echo of an engine, promising to grow louder. The captured P-51 Mustang arrived at Rechlin under a leaden-gray sky, transported on a massive flatbed truck and shrouded in canvas like a grim monument. As the covering was pulled away, an awed silence fell over Major Richter and his assembled team of engineers. There it sat, sleek and silver, a creature of the air now bound to the earth. Even with its propeller bent and its belly scarred from the crash landing, it possessed an undeniable grace. This was not just a machine. It was the embodiment of the threat that haunted their skies. It was the enemy. And yet, to the engineers who stood before it, it was also a masterpiece of aerodynamic design. They circled it with a mixture of clinical detachment and a craftsman's respect. They were professionals, men who could appreciate the elegant solution to an engineering problem, even if it was devised by their foe. They noted the smooth, flush-riveted skin, a detail that reduced drag. They admired the ingenious design of the laminar flow wing, a feature that contributed to its remarkable speed. Housed within its nose was the heart of the beast, a Packard V1650 Merlin engine. The irony was not lost on them. A British engine design, licensed and mass-produced by the Americans, was now the driving force behind the Luftwaffe's potential demise. It was a testament to the global, industrial nature of this war, a conflict of factories as much as of men. "All right," Richter announced, his voice sharp, cutting through the quiet reverence. "Let's get to work. I want a full systems analysis. Fuel, engine, hydraulics, everything. Treat it like a crime scene. Every component is a clue." The work began with a meticulous, almost surgical precision that was the hallmark of German engineering. This was their element. Faced with a puzzle of steel and wire, they were confident, methodical. The hangar at Rechlin, normally a place of innovation and German design, was transformed into a forensic laboratory. Blueprints were unrolled. Calipers and micrometers were brought out, and teams were assigned to specific sections of the aircraft. They drained the remaining fuel, taking samples to be analyzed for any unusual additives or chemical signatures. They carefully disassembled panels, documenting every wire, every hose, every bolt. Richter's initial theory, the one he held on to with a desperate hope, was that the answer lay in a hidden technological marvel. He fully expected his team to uncover an ingeniously designed, flexible fuel bladder tucked away in a forgotten corner of the fuselage, or a revolutionary fuel injection system that squeezed impossible efficiency from every drop of gasoline. The Americans, for all their perceived crudeness, were capable of cleverness. Perhaps they had developed a compact, high-pressure fuel pump or a new alloy for the engine pistons that allowed for a leaner fuel mixture without overheating. He envisioned a discovery that would, while alarming, at least make sense within his worldview. A complex problem, solved by a complex solution. Days turned into a week. The initial excitement in the hangar began to curdle into a quiet, simmering frustration. The reports that came back to Richter were a series of maddening dead ends. The fuel analysis came back negative. It was standard, high-octane aviation gasoline, indistinguishable from their own. The engine, once partially disassembled, was indeed a beautifully made Packard Merlin, but it held no secrets. It was a marvel of production engineering, with perfectly interchangeable parts, but it was not a miracle worker. It adhered strictly to the known laws of thermodynamics. The most painstaking search was for the hidden fuel tank. Engineers tapped every square inch of the fuselage and wings, listening for the hollow sound that might indicate a secret compartment. They studied the original American blueprints they had acquired through espionage, comparing them against the physical aircraft. Nothing. The internal fuel capacity was confirmed, down to the last liter, 269 gallons. The numbers on the physical aircraft matched the numbers on the paper, and the numbers on the paper still screamed that a combat mission to Berlin was impossible. The mood grew tense. The sense of an impending breakthrough was replaced by the unsettling feeling of being mocked. The silent silver aircraft seemed to hold its secret with an arrogant indifference. For Richter, the pressure was immense. Berlin was demanding answers, and he had none to give. His belief in a logical, technical explanation was being eroded with each negative report. The entire situation felt illogical, irrational. It was during a late evening inspection that the first crack in the mystery appeared, and it came from the most unlikely of places. A young mechanic, a boy named Hans, who was barely out of his apprenticeship, was tasked with examining the underwing hardpoints, the pylons, from which the external drop tanks were jettisoned. He had been working quietly, overshadowed by the senior engineers, who were focused on the engine and internal systems. He approached Richter with a hesitant cough. "Major," he began, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Something is odd." Richter, poring over fuel consumption charts, looked up with weary impatience. "What is it, son? Have you found a hidden valve?" "No, sir. It's the opposite of hidden. It's the attachment points for the external tanks, the fuel lines, the release mechanism. It all seems too simple." "Simple?" Richter asked, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean, simple?" "Well, sir," the young mechanic struggled to find the right words. "Everything else on this plane is so precisely made. The way the landing gear retracts, the fit of the cockpit canopy, it is all perfect. But this looks like an afterthought. The fuel line is just a basic rubber hose. The release shackle is a standard mechanical clamp. It's crude, almost clumsy." Richter was about to dismiss the boy's observation. The drop tanks were the least interesting part of the aircraft. They were disposable, jettisoned, before any serious combat began. They were a means to an end, not the end itself. He considered them little more than external baggage. How could something so peripheral hold the key to such a profound strategic problem? But he paused. The boy was right. There was a jarring inconsistency in the design philosophy. Why would a team of engineers capable of creating such a sophisticated flying machine resort to such a brutish, simple solution for a critical component like an external fuel system? The observation, insignificant as it seemed, planted a seed of doubt in Richter's mind. It was a loose thread in an otherwise perfect tapestry, and in his experience, it was often the loose threads, the seemingly unimportant details that everyone else overlooked, that led to the unraveling of the entire mystery. He looked away from the complex engine diagrams on his desk and stared out at the silver aircraft gleaming under the hangar lights. For the first time, he wasn't looking at its engine or its wings. He was looking at the empty space beneath them, and a new, unsettling question began to form in his mind. The hangar at Rechlin had become a pressure cooker of intellectual frustration. The silver Mustang sat in the center of the room, less a machine and more a monument to their own impotence. Major Richter's team had built a fortress of mathematics around the problem, a wall of logic and sound engineering principles. And yet, reality was laying siege to its walls, and the fortress was beginning to crumble. The numbers didn't lie, but the battlefield reports didn't lie either. The collision of these two truths was creating a schism in the very soul of German technical doctrine. Day after day, they reran the simulations. They factored in every conceivable variable: wind speed, air density at different altitudes, engine temperature, even the specific gravity of the American fuel. They calculated the energy expenditure of a single 90-degree turn at 400 miles per hour, the fuel consumed in a 5-second burst of machine gun fire. Each calculation was a finely crafted brick in their logical wall, and each brick led to the same inescapable conclusion. The P-51 could not do what it was reportedly doing. The numbers were a closed loop, a perfect logical prison from which there was no escape. For every elegant theory the engineers proposed, the silent ghost in the hangar offered a silent, irrefutable rebuttal. The physical evidence of the machine itself offered no support for their increasingly desperate hypotheses. There was no secret. There was no trick. There was only the machine, and the machine obeyed the laws of physics. And the laws of physics were telling them that their enemies were achieving the impossible. While Richter and his men wrestled with their equations in the sterile quiet of the laboratory, the skies over the fatherland were a canvas of fire and death. The story cuts away from the cold logic of Rechlin to the violent, three-dimensional reality of aerial combat. Lieutenant Erich Hartmann, a young Focke-Wulf 190 pilot, not the famous ace, but one of hundreds like him, finds his squadron scrambling to intercept a bomber formation near Magdeburg. They climb to meet the enemy, confident in their superior aircraft and their rigorous training. But then the call comes from their wing leader, his voice tight with strain over the radio. "Bandits! High at 6 o'clock! Mustangs! Many of them!" They came out of the sun, silver glints turning into sleek, predatory shapes. But these were not the tired, fuel-starved escorts they had been told to expect. They weren't flying cautiously, protecting their precious gasoline. They met the German charge head-on, their Merlin engines roaring at full combat power. Erich watched in horror as his wingman's full 190 was ripped apart by a blizzard of 50 caliber rounds from a Mustang that seemed to appear from nowhere. He broke hard, pulling his aircraft into a tight, gut-wrenching turn. But the Mustang stayed with him, matching his every move. The American pilot flew with an arrogance, an energy that spoke of a fuel tank that was still comfortably full. Erich's own fuel gauge was already a primary concern, a ticking clock in the back of his mind. For the American pilot, it seemed to be an afterthought. This was the reality that defied Richter's numbers. This was the terror that was breaking the back of the Luftwaffe. Back at Rechlin, these reports were no longer just data points. They were accusations. They accused Richter's team of incompetence, of missing something fundamental. For Richter, this was becoming a personal agony. His entire career, his entire identity, was built on the belief that German engineering was supreme because it was the most logical, the most precise, the most advanced. They didn't take shortcuts. They mastered the fundamentals. Now, that entire worldview was being assaulted. He started to wonder if the Americans hadn't found a better way, but a completely different way of thinking, one that was alien to the German obsession with perfection. It was a crisis not of engineering, but of philosophy. He stared at the clean, elegant lines of the P-51. Had they been so blinded by their own doctrine that they were missing something obvious? Was their search for a complex solution preventing them from seeing a simple one? The young mechanic's words echoed in his mind. It's crude. Almost clumsy. The attachment points for the drop tanks. The one part of the plane they had dismissed as peripheral, as unimportant baggage. Out of options, and spurred by a gnawing desperation, Richter made a decision. It felt like an act of surrender, an admission that their high-minded scientific approach had failed. Forget the engine for now, he announced to his bewildered team. Forget the internal tanks. I want to know everything about the external drop tanks. Everything. The request was met with confused silence. The drop tanks? They were just simple containers, jettisoned and forgotten. But Richter was adamant. We have reports of where these Mustangs have been engaged. The pilots discard the tanks before combat. I want a search team dispatched immediately. I want them to scour the fields and forests in those sectors. I want them to bring me back pieces of these disposable containers. I want to see for myself what the Americans are willing to throw away. The order seemed bizarre, a waste of resources. But it was an order from a man at the end of his rope. The search teams were sent out, soldiers fanning across the German countryside on a strange scavenger hunt. Days later, a truck rumbled back into Rechlin. A young, mud-spattered soldier, his face etched with confusion, approached Major Richter. He was carrying a large, curved piece of silvery material, jagged along one edge. He laid it carefully on a workbench. Major, we found several of these, the soldier reported, his voice hesitant. This was the largest piece, but there is something strange about it. Richter ran a gloved hand over the smooth, painted surface. It felt rigid, solid. What is it, soldier? What's strange? The soldier looked at his corporal, then back at Richter. He seemed embarrassed, as if he were about to say something foolish. Sir, he said, choosing his words carefully. When we found it, it was wedged against a tree. We tried to pry it loose. But the metal, it didn't bend. It didn't dent like aluminum would. He took a deep breath. It tore. Sir, it ripped like thick cardboard. A profound silence descended upon the hangar. Richter stared at the soldier, then down at the piece of wreckage. Tore? The word was an absurdity. Metal doesn't tear. It shears. It fractures. It shatters. It bends. But it does not tear. He picked up the piece. It was impossibly light. He ran his thumb along the jagged edge. It wasn't the clean, sharp break of fractured metal. It was fibrous. A cold electric dread, far worse than any simple frustration, washed over him. He was holding the answer in his hands, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was an answer that would change everything. The world seemed to shrink, collapsing into the space between Major Richter's eyes and the strange, fibrous object in his hands. The cavernous hangar, the gleaming Mustang, the anxious faces of his engineers, all of it faded into a muted background. The only sound was the frantic pounding of his own heart. The soldier's word hung in the air, an impossible, discordant note in the symphony of logic and reason. Tore. With a slow, deliberate motion, Richter placed the fragment on a clean steel workbench. He took off his gloves. He needed to feel this thing, to understand it through touch. He ran his bare fingertips over the smooth, silver-painted surface. It was cool, rigid, and gave no hint of the secret it held. Then, he turned it over. The torn edge was a mess of frayed, brownish fibers, like a piece of ancient, dried leather. It was utterly alien to the world of aeronautics he inhabited. He picked up a small, sharp utility knife from a nearby toolbox. The room was so quiet, he could hear the faint click as he extended the blade. He held the fragment down with one hand and, with the other, carefully began to scrape at the silver paint. He didn't apply much pressure. expecting the blade to skid across the surface of aluminum or a composite alloy. Instead, the knife bit in instantly. There was no screech of metal on metal. There was no resistance. There was only a soft, sibilant whisper, a dry, rasping sound, the sound of paper being scraped. With each pass of the blade, more of the silver lacquer flaked away, revealing what lay beneath. It wasn't the dull gleam of metal. It was a dense, laminated, brownish material. It was, unmistakably, paper. Richter straightened up, the knife clattering from his numb fingers onto the workbench. He stared at the exposed patch. Paper. He looked at the faces of his team, who were now crowding around, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. For a long moment, there was only a stunned, sepulchral silence. They had been searching for a miracle of advanced technology, a secret that would affirm their foe's genius in a way they could understand and respect. They were prepared to be awed by complexity, to be humbled by a brilliant, intricate design. But this was a profound, almost philosophical insult. Then, a single sound broke the silence. It started as a low chuckle from one of the senior engineers, a man with decades of experience designing elegant, durable components for the Luftwaffe. The chuckle was not one of humor, but of pure, unadulterated cynicism. It was the sound of a mind breaking. Soon, another joined in, then another. Within seconds, the hangar was filled with the sound of bitter, hysterical laughter. Men were leaning on workbenches, holding their heads in their hands, laughing at the sheer, mind-numbing absurdity of it all. They were laughing at themselves, at their meticulous calculations, their search for hidden valves and secret alloys, their belief in a sophisticated foe. They were laughing at the pride of German engineering, a pride built on machines crafted to perfection, designed to last for a generation. All of it, rendered meaningless by a disposable paper bucket. The Americans hadn't out-engineered them. They had sidestepped them. They had refused to even play the same game. To Richter and his men, it felt like being checkmated in a grand chess match by an opponent who had simply picked up a rock and smashed the board. It was a humiliation far deeper than any battlefield defeat. When the laughter subsided, it was replaced by a grim, focused energy. The object was rushed to the laboratory for immediate analysis. The mystery was no longer what it was, but how it was made, and what it was made of. The results came back within hours, confirming the unbelievable. The material was composed of multiple layers of craft paper, the same kind of processed wood pulp used to make grocery bags. These layers had been bonded together under pressure with a resorcinol formaldehyde resin, a type of waterproof glue, to create a rigid, shell-like structure. The interior was coated with a cellulose-based lacquer to make it impervious to the corrosive effects of aviation fuel. And the exterior was painted silver to protect it from the elements and, presumably, to make it look like metal from a distance. It was a marvel, but not of metallurgy or advanced aerodynamics. It was a marvel of chemical engineering and ruthless pragmatism. It was designed to do one job: hold 108 gallons of fuel, survive for a few hours in the harsh conditions at 20,000 feet, and then be discarded without a second thought. It was the epitome of good enough. As Richter read the lab report, the initial shock and humiliation began to recede, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. He walked back to the hangar and stood before the captured P-51. He saw it now with new eyes. He had been looking for a secret hidden within the plane. He had been wrong. The plane itself wasn't the secret. The true secret was the philosophy that had created the disposable paper tank. He held the fibrous, torn piece of paper in one hand. This object, which they had initially dismissed as unimportant, was in fact the single most important component in the entire strategic equation. It wasn't a sign of American desperation or poverty of resources. It wasn't a clumsy afterthought. It was a calculated act of industrial genius. And as he stood there, a question began to form in his mind. A question far more terrifying than how the Mustangs reached Berlin. It was no longer a question of what this object was made of. The truly chilling question the one that would haunt him for the rest of the war, was why. Why would a nation that possessed the greatest aluminum production capacity on Earth, a nation that could afford to build entire fleets of bombers from the precious light alloy, deliberately choose to make a critical piece of military hardware out of paper? The answer to that question, he suddenly realized, would tell him not how they had lost a single battle, but how they were going to lose the entire war. The chilling truth that dawned on Major Klaus Richter in the sterile silence of the Rechlin hangar was an answer that could not be found in any German engineering textbook. To understand the why behind the paper drop tank, one had to leave the world of meticulous German craftsmanship and travel across an ocean into the roaring, fiery heart of a different kind of war machine. The story of this simple object was not written in laboratories, but on the factory floors of a nation that had fully and terrifyingly awakened. The scene shifts from the quiet precision of Germany to the organized chaos of the American industrial heartland. Picture the Willow Run facility in Michigan, a factory so vast it had its own airfield and post office. Here, there was no quiet reverence for a single, perfect machine. There was only the deafening roar of a million moving parts, the percussive symphony of rivet guns, the hiss of hydraulic presses, and the constant forward motion of the assembly line. This was not a workshop. It was a volcano of production, erupting with the machinery of war. And the people working these lines were not just skilled male mechanics. They were a cross-section of America itself. They were former farmers from Oklahoma, shopkeepers from Ohio, and, most visibly, they were women. Millions of Rosie the Riveters who had traded their kitchens for the factory floor, their hands skillfully assembling the very bombers and fighters that were darkening Germany's skies. They were fueled by patriotism, union wages, and a shared, unshakable belief in their cause. This was the engine room of the arsenal of democracy, and it operated on a philosophy that was utterly alien to Richter and his colleagues. The paper drop tank was born from this philosophy. It was not, as some in the German high command initially sneered, a product of desperation or American poverty. It was the result of a cold, brutal, and brilliant strategic calculation. The United States entered the war with an almost incomprehensible industrial advantage. In 1944, American factories would produce nearly 98,000 aircraft, a number that dwarfed the combined output of all the Axis powers. More critically, the US produced nearly 10 times more aluminum than Germany. They were not lacking in strategic materials, they were swimming in them. So why use paper? The answer was the ruthless optimization of resources. An American strategic planner, looking at the entire global conflict as a single, massive equation, would ask a simple question. Why should we use a single ounce of precious, a strategic-grade aluminum, the very metal needed for a fighter's wing spar, or a Tate bomber's fuselage on a component that is designed to be thrown away over enemy territory? The idea was pioneered in Britain by the Bowater Paper Company, which devised a method of creating sturdy containers from processed pulp. But it was American industry that perfected the art of mass-producing them. Companies like the Mengele Company of Louisville, Kentucky, a furniture manufacturer, completely retooled their operations. Men and women who had once been crafting fine wooden cabinets were now pressing and gluing layers of craft paper into the sleek, aerodynamic shape of a fuel tank. They could produce thousands upon thousands of them, cheaply and quickly. Each paper tank that rolled off the line freed up enough aluminum to build a critical component for another P-51. They weren't just building tanks, they were building more fighters by proxy. It was a strategy of abundance, of leveraging an overwhelming advantage to create an even greater one. The numbers were staggering, almost abstract in their scale. While a team of German engineers might spend a week debating the precise metallurgical composition of a single component to make it perfect, the North American aviation plant in Dallas was rolling a new, good enough P-51 Mustang off the assembly line every few hours. The American war effort was a tidal wave of materiel. It could absorb losses that would cripple the Wehrmacht and replace them in a matter of weeks. This industrial disparity was also a reflection of a deeper moral chasm between the two systems. The American war machine, for all its flaws, was powered by the willing labor of a free people mobilized for a common cause. The Rosies, on the assembly line, were participants in a national crusade. They were well fed, their children were in schools, and they were fighting for a future they believed in. In contrast, the German war effort, under Albert Speer, was becoming a dark miracle, built on a foundation of human misery. By 1944, it was critically dependent on the forced labor of millions of people, dragged from conquered nations, Poles, French, Dutch, and countless others. They were slaves, working in horrific conditions, often intentionally starved and brutalized. The very factories producing Germany's advanced jet fighters and V-2 rockets were often staffed by men and women who prayed for an Allied bomb to grant them release. It was a war of free hands against hands in chains, and that moral imbalance had a tangible, strategic effect. A motivated, well-fed worker will always outperform a starving slave. Back in the hangar at Rechlin, this crushing reality began to settle upon Major Klaus Richter. He held the piece of paper in his hand, but he no longer saw it as a simple material. He saw the sprawling factories. He heard the roar of the assembly lines. He pictured the millions of determined faces working in shifts around the clock. He finally understood they had been obsessed with winning the duel in the sky, perfecting their machines to be the sharpest swords imaginable. But they had never considered the nature of the forge. The Germans had built a small number of exquisite, master-crafted blades. The Americans had built a river of steel, a brute-force torrent of swords, spears, and armor that was now crashing down upon them. They were not fighting American pilots. They were fighting the American farmer, the American factory worker, the American engineer, and the entire, terrifying might of a continent united in purpose. He had solved the riddle of how the Mustang reached Berlin. In doing so, he had uncovered the far more devastating truth. They were engaged in a war that they could not possibly win. The discovery at Rechlin was not an academic exercise. The simple, brown paper fragment in Major Richter's hands was a death sentence, and the execution would be carried out in the skies over Germany every day for the rest of the war. The paper drop tank was not merely an invention. It was a key that unlocked a new and devastating chapter of the air war. It was the small, insignificant-looking catalyst for a massive, violent chain reaction, a ripple effect that would shatter the Luftwaffe and cripple the Reich's ability to resist. Before the long-range Mustang, American bomber crews flying deep into Germany called the final leg of their journey Coffin Corner. It was the point where their shorter-range escorts, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, had to turn back, their fuel gauges running low. From that moment on, the bomber boxes were on their own, lumbering through hostile skies, prey for the wolves of the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilots knew this routine. They would wait, patiently, for the little friends to depart, and then they would descend upon the vulnerable bombers with brutal efficiency. The losses for the U.S. 8th Air Force were staggering, at times unsustainable. The paper tank changed everything. Suddenly, there was no Coffin Corner. The bomber crews looked out their windows on the long, perilous journey to Berlin or the oil fields of Ploesti and saw the sleek, reassuring shapes of the P-51 Mustangs flying with them all the way to the target and all the way back. The American pilots, now flush with fuel, were no longer just defensive escorts. They became hunters. They were unleashed. After protecting the bombers, they were free to go big game hunting, dropping down to treetop level to strafe airfields, rail yards, and anything else that moved. The hunters had become the hunted, and German territory was now the hunting ground. This new reality forced the Luftwaffe into an impossible strategic dilemma. They could no longer wait and pick their battles. To defend the vital war industries being systematically obliterated by daylight bombing, they had to rise and fight. But every time they did, they flew into a carefully laid trap. They would climb to meet the bombers only to be ambushed by squadrons of Mustangs diving out of the sun, their tanks now empty and their planes light and agile. It was a war of attrition the Germans were mathematically guaranteed to lose. The cost was measured not just in machines, but in men. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a finely crafted instrument of war, requiring thousands of skilled man-hours to produce. A P-51 Mustang was designed for mass production, rolling off the assembly line with astonishing speed. When a Bf 109 was shot down, it was a significant industrial loss. When a P-51 was lost, 3 more were already being built to take its place. But the true, irreplaceable loss was the man in the cockpit. German pilots were the product of years of rigorous, intensive training. They were, man for man, among the best in the world. But by 1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding its lifeblood. The veteran aces, the experten with hundreds of victories, were being worn down and killed. The new pilots, rushed through training to fill the depleted ranks, were sent into combat with barely enough hours to master their complex aircraft. Their average life expectancy in combat could be measured in a handful of missions. They were lambs, being sent to the slaughter. Across the channel, the situation was the reverse. American pilots were being trained by the thousands in the safety of the vast continental United States. They arrived in England with more flight hours than many German veterans. If a pilot was shot down but survived, he was sent back to a training command to pass on his experience. The American system was a robust, sustainable ecosystem of talent. The German system had become a fragile, hemorrhaging artery. The statistics tell a brutal story. In a series of battles in late February 1944, which came to be known as Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost over 350 fighters, and more critically, nearly 100 of its irreplaceable veteran pilots. The American losses were also heavy, but they were a manageable fraction of a much larger whole. The ripple effect of the paper tank was washing away the very foundations of German air power. The bitter acknowledgement of this reality came from the very top. General Major Adolf Galland, a man who had fought in the skies since the Spanish Civil War and was the embodiment of the Luftwaffe's fighting spirit, saw the writing on the wall. He is famously quoted as having said that the day he flew a mission and saw P-51 Mustangs flying over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. It was a simple, devastating admission. The presence of those fighters, made possible by a disposable paper container, signaled the end of any hope for defending the Reich. The war in the air was over, decided not by the courage of the German pilots, but by the cold, hard logic of the American factory floor. The Luftwaffe did not die with a single dramatic bang, but with a long, agonizing whimper. Its strength was sapped, its pilots were ground down, and its industrial base was being turned to rubble by bombers that could now fly with impunity. The paper tank had given the Allies complete air supremacy, and with that supremacy, they could pave the way for the invasion of Normandy and the final defeat of the Third Reich. The story, however, does not end with the smoldering wreckage of German fighters. Back at Rechlin, the strategic catastrophe unfolding in the skies was mirrored by a quiet, intellectual one on the ground. The engineers, who had dedicated their lives to a philosophy of technical perfection, now had to watch as their nation was dismantled by a product of what they considered crude simplicity. What does a man like Klaus Richter do when he is forced to confront the fact that his entire belief system, his professional pride, the very principles upon which he has built his life, have not only been proven wrong, but have actively contributed to his country's destruction? The war for Germany was being lost in the air. But for these men, the war within their own minds was just beginning. The storm of war raged on outside the fences of the Rechlin Test Center. But within the mind of Major Klaus Richter, a different, more intimate battle was being fought. The initial humiliation of the paper tank discovery, the bitter laughter that had echoed through the hangar, had faded. In its place grew a profound and unsettling clarity. It was the clarity of a man who climbs a mountain his entire life, only to reach the summit and realize he has been climbing the wrong one. His world had not just been turned upside down, its very foundations had been proven to be sand. In the quiet hours of the night, long after his team had retired to their barracks with hollowed eyes and weary spirits, Richter found himself drawn back to the captured P-51. He would walk around the silent aircraft, not as an engineer looking for flaws, but as a student before a stern and unforgiving teacher. He began to see a different kind of beauty in its design, a beauty that his training had never taught him to recognize. It wasn't the flawless perfection of a single, hand-fitted component. It was the brutal, elegant logic of its entirety. He saw how the landing gear was designed not just to be strong, but to be easily replaced on a muddy airfield by a mechanic with basic training. He saw how the cockpit instruments were standardized, allowing a pilot to switch from one aircraft to another with minimal disorientation. He saw how the engine, for all its power, was mounted in a way that allowed it to be swapped out in a matter of hours, not days. The Mustang wasn't a single exquisite jewel. It was a system, a holistic concept, where every part was subservient to the ultimate goals of producibility, repairability, and ruthless efficiency. His own philosophy, the German philosophy, had been the opposite. They engineered masterpieces. They chased the last 5% of performance, regardless of the cost in complexity or man-hours. Their magnificent Tiger tank was a perfect example. A fortress of steel, almost invincible on the battlefield, but so complex and over-engineered that it was a nightmare to produce and maintain. For every Tiger that rolled out of a German factory, the Americans and Soviets produced dozens of Shermans and T-34 seconds tanks that were good enough, and which won the war through sheer, overwhelming numbers. Richter saw this same fatal flaw in his own work, in the beautiful, intricate designs for jet engines and rocket planes that lay on his desk. They were technological marvels, years ahead of anything the Allies possessed. But they were fragile, temperamental, and consumed vast resources and skilled labor that Germany no longer had. They were chasing wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen, to magically turn the tide of the war. They were praying for a miracle of technology to save them from a disaster of logistics. The paper tank was the ultimate symbol of this philosophical divide. It was the anti-wonder weapon. It was mundane, unglamorous, and disposable. And it had been more strategically decisive than any of Germany's futuristic jets or guided bombs. It had won the war not by being the best possible object, but by being the most effective solution to a practical problem. This realization was more than just an engineering lesson. It was a devastating critique of the entire Nazi system. The regime's obsession with monolithic, awe-inspiring projects, its focus on theatrical grandeur over practical substance, its internal rivalries and inefficient command structures, all of it was reflected in their approach to technology. They had underestimated their enemy on a fundamental level, dismissing American culture as a materialistic, mongrel creation incapable of true genius. They had failed to see that the genius of America was not in creating a perfect object, but in creating a perfect system for producing millions of good enough objects. This was Richter's reckoning. He understood now that he, and men like him, in their pursuit of technical perfection, had been unwitting architects of their own nation's downfall. Their pride had been a blinder, their expertise a trap. They had given the High Command the perfect excuse to ignore the logistical nightmare unfolding around them, allowing them to cling to the fantasy that a single technological breakthrough could reverse the inevitable. As the war ground to its agonizing conclusion, a strange thing began to happen in the minds of Richter and some of his fellow engineers. The bitterness of defeat began to transform into a hard-won wisdom. They were absorbing the most painful, yet most valuable, lesson of their lives. They were learning from their enemy. This lesson would become a quiet, unheralded part of Germany's post-war legacy. In the years after 1945, many of these brilliant minds would be recruited by the victors. Men who had designed the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs would go on to help shape the American and Western aerospace industries. They brought with them their incredible technical skills, but they also brought the searing memory of the paper tank. They brought the hard-earned understanding of concepts like standardization, interchangeability, and designing for mass production. The painful lesson of the P-51's clumsy efficiency would ironically help fuel the West's technological dominance during the Cold War. Richter stood at his desk, the single piece of laminated paper sitting next to a complex blueprint for a turbine blade. Two objects, two philosophies, two destinies. One represented a brilliant but flawed obsession with perfection. The other, a humble, pragmatic path to overwhelming victory. The war had provided the definitive, brutal answer as to which was superior. The question that remained, echoing from the wreckage of the Third Reich, was a simple one. Has the world truly learned the lesson that was written on that piece of paper? The story of the paper drop tank, born from a desperate need and solved in a secret German laboratory, is more than just a dusty footnote in the annals of World War II. It's a powerful parable about two clashing philosophies, a lesson written not in ink, but in the harsh and unforgiving arithmetic of industrial warfare. It began as a simple riddle in the sky. How could an enemy fighter fly farther than physics allowed? The answer, discovered on a workbench in Rechlin, was as simple as it was devastating. A disposable container made of paper, glue, and pragmatic genius. This single, humble object didn't just carry fuel. It carried the full weight of a new way of war. It represented a strategic choice that prioritized relentless efficiency over fragile perfection, quantity over theoretical quality, and the good enough solution, delivered by the thousands over the flawless masterpiece that arrived too late and in too few numbers. The German engineers at Rechlin were checkmated not by a superior weapon, but by a superior system of production, a system that had turned the vast expanse of American factories into the single most decisive weapon of the war. But the echo of that paper tank, falling silently through the European sky, doesn't end in 1945. Its lesson reverberates through our world today, in boardrooms, in laboratories, and on the modern battlefield. How often do we see corporate giants, obsessed with creating the perfect, feature-loaded product, toppled by nimble startups, offering a simpler, cheaper, and more adaptable solution? The history of technology is filled with tales of elegant, superior technologies that lost in the marketplace to competitors who were simply better at manufacturing and scaling their good-enough alternative. Think of the modern military landscape. We are once again witnessing a dramatic shift, where the strategic value of billion-dollar aircraft carriers and fifth-generation stealth fighters is being challenged by the proliferation of cheap, mass-produced, and disposable drones. A simple drone, costing only a few $1,000s, can now threaten a multi-million-dollar tank. This is the spirit of the paper tank, reborn in the age of silicon and composites. It is a stark reminder that the nature of power is not always found in the most advanced or complex weapon, but sometimes in the most accessible and numerous. This brings us to the great, lingering question of this story, a debate that continues to this day. Was the fall of the Luftwaffe a failure of German imagination and strategic arrogance, or was it an inevitable victory for an American system that, from the very beginning, understood that modern wars are ultimately won by the nation with the deepest reserves and the most efficient factories? This is where the story leaves the pages of history and becomes a conversation, and we want you to be a part of it. The story of the paper tank shows that sometimes a war is not decided by the sharpest swords, but by the forges that can produce millions of them. We want to hear your opinion. What do you believe is the greatest lesson from Rechlin? Was it the ingenuity of the Allies, the hubris of the Third Reich's leadership, or simply the unstoppable, overwhelming power of mass production? Leave a comment below and tell us which factor you think is most decisive in any major conflict. Is it tactical brilliance, technological superiority, or sheer industrial might? Your answer might surprise you, and it will certainly enrich our understanding of these powerful historical forces. If you believe that these forgotten stories, the tales of courage, innovation, and the hard-learned lessons of the past are essential to understanding our present and navigating our future, then please subscribe to our channel. Join our community as we continue to uncover the secrets of history that have shaped the world we live in today.